Welcome to the Golden Age of Cinema podcast, a film review show where our panelists share their take on films from the Golden Age of Cinema, the 1990s. Today, we're joined by host Matthew Sutton and panelists Michael Holmes and Seb James to discuss 1995's Four Rooms, starring Tim Roth and directed by Alison Anders, Alexandra Rockwell, Robert Rodriguez, and Quentin Tarantino. We hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Golden Age of Cinema. My thanks again to my two guests, Seb Gemez and Mikey Holmes. Last week, for those who tuned in, you may recall we reviewed Point Break. We've kind of taken a different tact this week in reviewing 1995's mishmash of directathon, Four Rooms. I cannot give this film an introduction worthy of its due, so I'm going to hand it over to Seb, who decided to choose the film this week. Seb, can you give us a bit of background and the reason why you chose it, please?
Sure. I'll start with a brief synopsis and background. So Four Rooms, as you say, was released in 1995, starring Tim Roth, and follows the misadventures of a bellhop's first night on the job at the Hotel Monsignor in Hollywood on New Year's Eve. Over the course of the film, we see him deal with 4 rooms, providing 4 separate short stories, each directed by a different director: Alison Anders, Alexandra Rockwell, Robert Rodriguez, and Quentin Tarantino. During the wild, wacky night, we see Ted seduced by a coven of witches, held at gunpoint in a crazy marital roleplay, tasked with babysitting some troublesome kids, and offered $1,000 for 1 second's worth of work. This film is just like a total wild card from me. So basically, I first came across it when I was at university, and it was about the time that Django Unchained was coming out, so like 2013, I think. And me and a friend of mine were basically just going through every part of Tarantino's filmography in the build-up to Django Unchained's release, and we, went through all of his filmography, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Inglourious Bastard, Kill Bill, etc., etc. And my mate mentioned that there was this other film that he had a director credit for, and that it also had Tim Roth. So I was intrigued.
Reservoir Dogs fame.
Of Reservoir Dogs fame, exactly. So I was intrigued, and as I watched it, I basically hung in there through a lot of what we will get into, because I knew that at some point Tarantino would come up, and it would all be worth it, just because I really, really liked Tarantino. And turns out that, in my opinion, it was, because I really, really love the Tarantino bit. And in fact, since then, whenever I watch it, I just sort of tend to skip over the first 3 rooms and go straight to the 4th one, which is directed and written by Quentin Tarantino.
Sebby, listening to your introduction there, I can begin to understand how this film was greenlit. The introduction that you've gone through makes it sound so impressive, and yet the product itself is much less impressive than your introduction just then.
Thank you very much. Although I probably think that's not saying much.
We might only be an episode and a bit into this podcast, but never has a truer word been spoken in about the hour runtime that we've all spent together discussing films. I've got to say, I thought it was truly bloody awful. It was the first time I watched it was about 2 hours ago. And yeah, so ironic, considering where you came in the last episode and you'd come from this with fresh eyes. I think I'm correct in saying that me and Mikey have come with it with fresh eyes. And Mikey, you hit the nail on the head there. Considering the cast, considering the production, the list of directors, and actually where it comes slap bang in the middle of the decade, when prior to that, there are, the people with director credits have directed films earlier on in the 90s, which are vastly superior. I couldn't believe, it it's going a bit much to call it a film.
Let me pick up there, Matty. I agree. The first time I saw it was last night, though I do remember at the time when it came out, 1995. Tarantino was riding high. His star was not so much on the rise, but had risen almost as high as it could go. I have developed something of a cynical theory about this film, which ties back to the fact that post Pulp Fiction, Tarantino was just so hot, and that was that and Reservoir Dogs were such original films, rejuvenated a number of actors who had been forgotten or undiscovered, just so fresh, and considering that Pulp Fiction came out the year before, I've formed the belief that Miramax and others wanted to get something out with the Tarantino brand attached to it within a fairly short space of time, and this, in my view, this film thrown together sort of reeks of haste, an unfinished, really four unfinished scripts cobbled together, a hastily assembled cast, enough big names to draw a crowd maybe, and thrown out there in the hope that it would make a quick buck.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting theory. From what I have researched on this film and sort of everything that I've read and watched on it, it seems like Miramax had these four directors on their books. Obviously, they definitely had Quentin Tarantino on their books, and Alison Anders and Alexandra Rockwell both had sort of hits or semi-hits before this. And Robert Rodriguez had just come off the back of El Mariachi.
Desperado,
which is another great film that we've watched together. Matt, do you remember when we watched Desperado together?
I do, mate, yes.
And I don't think you like that one either.
No, I think at the time I thought that was a crime committed to celluloid. How little did I know?
It was just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, so both of them, well, all four of them had sort of hits and were up-and-coming directors, and obviously this was just Miramax's way of sort of packaging them all together and exposing a wider audience to them, coming for the names such as Quentin Tarantino and Tim Roth, and hopefully staying for the likes of Alison Anders and Alexandra Rockwell. But it didn't quite work out that way.
Can I just say, if you've, I'd be interested to get how far you delved into your research, because I'd like to get an understanding of budget, production. So when was it filmed? Because it seems, considering it's coming in at 1995, was this just, as Mikey said, was it just cobbled together? It strikes me as impossible that this was produced post Pulp Fiction, post Reservoir Dogs. Surely the quality control from that standpoint is, I mean, where was this released, or when was this released? Who is it marketed to? Who's its audience? Because, I mean, the standard Tarantino tropes are there, and we'll unpick it in due course, I've no doubt. The multiple different scenarios, a lot of the situational comedy and humor is very Tarantino-esque. You can tell he's got fingerprints all over his writing. Seb, you're probably more up to speed with what Robert Rodriguez does. I wouldn't be surprised if you had to tell me that I think Reservoir Dogs came out in 1991. I wouldn't 92. Be surprised if you told me that 92. I wouldn't have been surprised if you'd have told me this came out in 92 and Reservoir Dogs came out, afterwards. It just, to me, if anything, this would be a regression from the kind of stuff that he'd done. And, he's somebody that anybody who follows film knows that has quite a high quality control on what he produces and what he does. And I do agree with you, actually. The last scene is by far and away the best one. But did you pick anything more up on your research on, when it was produced, when filming took place, budget? I mean, I'd love to know how it performed at the box office.
Yeah, so in terms of budget and box office, it was budgeted for 4 million, and its box office take was just about break even. It made 4.25 million. So, like, it was a tiny moneymaker for Miramax. Released on Christmas Day in 1995, which is a bit bizarre.
I did see that, yeah.
And in terms of its audience, I think you're quite right in that its audience is really weird because it has an 18 rating here in the UK, it has an R rating in the US. So it's really got a teeny tiny niche of an audience, like a super small slice of a pie of sort of probably avant-garde film goers who have seen Tarantino, who know a bit about the other directors on the card as well, and just were thinking, okay, well, this looks like something that would interest me. But also, there are some other weird things. As you say, Tarantino kind of does have his fingerprints all over it in some ways, and in other ways he doesn't. He was one of the executive producers, so him and Alexandra Rockwell were the main executive producers, and Tim Roth had a lot of not quite directorial level, but a lot of sort of creative input because he's the one constant throughout the whole thing. In terms of it's a showcase for these four directors, right? And in my opinion, I agree. Quentin's bit is by far and away like so much better than any of the others, and it shows the class of director he is versus the others. And what's quite funny, I think, Mikey, you had a look into this, what Alison Anders and Alexandra Rockwell have done since this film came out.
Yes, I have. I think Alison Anders had a good film in 1992 called Gas Food Lodging, which included an actress in this, Iona Skye. But since then, her filmography is very modest. Post this, several movies that were mildly well known, and then a lot of sort of TV and sort of made for TV type movies. Alexandra Scott has a much more modest filmography. This is one of his better known efforts. So I think, as you say, in the mid 90s, they were on the books at Miramax. They were, they had potential, etc. And whether this was a vehicle to try and advance them, obviously it didn't work out.
Yeah, and I think with Quentin's bit in particular, Matty, you said someone with such high quality control of what he releases. I think now that's definitely the case. But back in the 90s, if you think about a lot of what he did, he was, to coin a phrase from our last film, Point Break, he was young, dumb, and full of cum, and just went. I just went off on one a little bit in the 90s.
You better
especially,
do that.
Post when he came to promise and fame for Pulp Fiction, he released this, and then the project that he did right after this was with Robert Rodriguez, which was From Dusk Till Dawn, which is another like pretty out there B movie. I
mean, come on, that is a great film.
That is a great film.
So basically, 94 Pulp Fiction, 95 this, 96 From Dusk Till Dawn, 97 Jackie Brown. 3 of those are pretty good.
And this is and the thing is that his bit, as you say, is pretty good. And I think in terms of what he, how he saw this was just an opportunity to do this one scene which he clearly had in his head. We'll talk about it in greater depth a little later on. But as you say, his last 40 minutes of the film has his fingerprints all over it. It's totally metatextual, pop culture referencing all over the place. It's got a several showstopper scenes and speeches and stuff like that. And it's just like, it's so obviously Quentin Tarantino being totally and utterly self-indulgent.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Let's move on to the aforementioned 4 rooms. What we'll do is go through each room. Seb, I'd like you to provide an overview, and then we can maybe just briefly dissect and give our own thoughts on it. I will just say one thing before we move on to that. It was also the recipient of a Razzie Award for Worst Supporting Actress. Guess who won that?
Madonna.
Correct.
Hilarious.
There's it all.
And well deserved. Well deserved. So Room 1, The Missing Ingredient, and directed by Alison Anders, which features the Razzie-winning Madonna and Iona Skye, where we see Ted the bellboy seduced by a coven of witches in the honeymoon suite as they attempt to resurrect their cursed goddess. So what were your thoughts on this one then, guys?
I struggled to see the point of it, to be honest. It just seemed very, very random.
Totally.
I mean, obviously not to be taken seriously, but then it wasn't really funny either. So I didn't enjoy it. You know, this is the room where Madonna did get her Razzie Award. To be honest, I thought maybe that was a little undeserving because she didn't really seem to do very much. Though, I mean, she was bad in it.
Well, she stuffed her the tip down her breast and then just like stands there and then growls several times during this.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty deserved.
I mean, all of the actresses in this, I think, you know, I didn't recognize I didn't recognize the names when I went through the cast listing, but I did when I watched it. I did recognize the faces. A lot of or most of these actresses were, you know, they had done some relatively prominent stuff in the 90s, but by this point they were, I think that they were C grade, maybe even a couple of sort of D grade listers, and this obviously didn't do them any favors. It's sort of partly why I developed the theory around this being a sort of cynical ploy to cash in on Brand Tarantino. The cast did seem to be a little if not hastily assembled, not first choice. These are sort of very much second string. Madonna, I think, certainly in the 90s was basically just a name. I mean, she's not a good actress. You know, she's done a couple of reasonable sort of efforts over the years, but you know, I think it's an easy one because she's so prominent. Slap her name on the billboard and it might get some traction. But this room, this scene, it was a bit pointless. I didn't enjoy it.
What did you think, Matteo?
I just struggled with, like Mikey said, I struggled with the point of it. I mean, there were a couple of little jokes and titters which were mildly funny. So the poems that and the little rhymes that they were doing were quite good fun. But just as a way to start the evening off, it just seemed very stilted. The dialogue didn't really flow that particularly well. The jokes weren't great. Yeah, I don't really feel we need to add much more to what Mikey said there. Madonna, I mean, yeah, slap a bit of name recognition on it, but then you could argue at the time, why do you need any further name recognition? She probably got paid that the majority of that £4 million budget probably went up her nose anyway. I wasn't impressed with it as an opening to it. It really, as I was exchanging texts with you at the time, I was really quite upset with you, Seb, when I'd started when I was about 15 minutes in. But yes, things can only get better, as they say. And if we move on to room 2.
Yeah, let's skip over this. Although I do quickly on room 1 want to point out that when Iona Skye says her poem about how she swallowed the bloke's sperm and all the witches freak out, one of them breathes fire, which is just like so bizarre. It's pretty terrible, and frankly, Alison Anders was hardly seen again, and you can kind of understand why. So,
is that right? That was the end of her career, was it?
Certainly in film, yeah. She hardly did much after that. She did a couple of television spots here and there, but it really did peter out. And yeah, I mean, like, there's no surprise. So, room 2. Room 2 is The Wrong Man, directed by Alexandra Rockwell, and features David Proval and Jennifer Beals, where Ted accidentally takes ice to room 404, and finds himself in the middle of a fantasy hostage situation with a man and his wife. So, again, gentlemen, thoughts?
Again, I found it a little pointless. I mean, at the end of it, you sort of made sense. It made a bit more sense when you realize, okay, there's another guy called Ted who's going to the room. That kind of makes a bit more sense. But initially, I just found it awkward. I think Jennifer Beals not a great actress, and she spends most of it tied up. I found the scene where, it seemed to me that the gunman was mentally ill, so we were watching a mental, an episode of, or somebody having an episode. So that was a bit awkward. And then he gets into the bathroom, and he sort of climbs out the window and leans up and asks the guy for help. I didn't find
That's a terrible scene, isn't it?
It is real. I mean, I didn't find it entertaining. I found it again a bit pointless and really a bit awkward.
Do you know the guy that plays and I was racking my brains at the time, the guy that plays the husband?
David Proval.
David Proval was...
Sopranos fame.
Well, prior to that, 1973 was in Mean Streets.
No way.
So he was at the embryonic stage of both a Tarantino flick and a Scorsese flick. And I think I know which he's probably more proud of having on his credits. But Alexander
He's also
Rockwell,
come off the Shawshank Redemption. So, I mean,
of course,
He's in the Shawshank Redemption as well.
He's one of his one of Tim Robbins' prison comrades. But to go from Shawshank Redemption to this, that's a big jump in quality.
Yeah. But Jennifer Beal, I kind of felt that watching it was Alexander Rockwell just acting out some kind of sadomasochistic marriage fetish, because he was married to Jennifer Beal, wasn't he?
Yeah, which makes this really, really weird.
So, but I thought it was certainly better than the first film. It took a bit of time to get going. I actually thought it was quite funny in parts. The bit where he was dangling outside the window, and it tied it into... It was in the first... Is it? I can't remember specifically, but it ties into the first room because they call downstairs for the ice. The guys having like the frat party or whatever it is, asking for the ice. So there was a couple of nice little touches. I thought the gag ran out of steam pretty quickly. So when the guy was calling for his heart pills and then Tim Roth panicked, that's fine. But then going, and it just felt a little... By the end of it was just a bit... I agree with Mikey. What it said at the end, where tied in with the other party guy, another Ted, it was okay, but it wasn't, there's not much more we can give on it, is there? Other than, Jennifer Beal looked hot.
I kind of agree that the first half of this is pretty boring and quite forgettable. But there is that funny scene where Ted has a freak out over his own name, which is kind of like a bit funny, and you get a little bit of Tim Roth kind of freaking out and overacting a little bit. I think that David Proval in this bit is actually like really quite bad. I think his performance is just like pretty awful. As you say, Mikey, he's kind of like, obviously this character has got a screw loose in the head, but it's just an absolutely bizarre performance. And the slapstick bit of him when he's hanging out the window is kind of trying to be really funny, just it doesn't land for me. Then I think the best bit is actually when Angela, Jennifer Beals' character, gets her gag removed, and she starts fucking with Ted the bellboy, and is like, oh well, that's not very nice because you had sex with me and stuff like that. And the bit I think is actually quite funny, but the writing is pretty goddamn awful. I mean, like, all the cock chat is pretty bizarre.
Yeah, it's not a good segment fundamentally. Really.
No, it's not very good. It's just a bit bizarre. And on it tying in, actually, it does tie in with the third room when Siegfried, David Proval's character, has to pick up the phone and it says, "No, we don't have any needles here, just a big fucking gun." Because that ties into the next room when the two kids call some random room,
Yes, indeed.
which is actually quite funny. Right, so moving on to room 3, The Misbehavers, which is directed by Robert Rodriguez, which features Antonio Banderas and Tamil Tomita, with Salma Hayek dancing on the telly, by the way. So during which Ted...
Right, okay.
Yeah, that's Salma Hayek dancing on the TV, which is quite funny. So Ted brings champagne to room 309 and is tasked by a scary Mexican gangster to babysit his 2 troublesome kids. I mean, in my opinion, this is where it actually starts getting, well, a lot better. But what are your guys' thoughts on it? Mikey, how about we start with you?
I think of the 4 segments, of the 4 rooms, I actually liked this one the best. I think Antonio Banderas, he's generally very watchable, and I thought he was good in this. I thought overall Tim Roth's performance in this film is not his best work, but in this segment, I thought it was his best of the movie. I thought it was an entertaining sort of premise, and sort of watching the children get up to various antics and the what's that smell.
Yeah, that's a nice little bit of foreshadowing, isn't it? The whole smell thing.
I think that did work. I thought it had some quite funny moments, in sort of dark sort of way, with the rubbing the Vicks Vapor Rub on their eyes so they don't.
Yeah, that is
open their eyes, etc. And I thought the end sort of end scene where Antonio Banderas is on his way up, and the room's on fire. He's got a dead girl on one hand, and he's trying to rope the kids in with the other. That did make me laugh. So of the 4 segments, I did actually find this one worked the best, and it was entertaining.
Matty, what are your thoughts on this one?
In terms of what came before, I actually quite enjoyed it. I thought, I actually agree with Mikey. I thought of the 4 rooms, it was probably Tim Roth's best performance. He wasn't doing any quirky hip dancing and mincing about walk. With probably what little script he had, I thought he did quite a good little take on, dismissing his responsibilities towards the kids whilst also acknowledging how scared he was of the Mexican gangster, Antonio Banderas' gangster. The one little bit of flair which I did like, which if there could have been a thimble full of creativity from this taken and sprinkled across the rest of the film, would have been magnificent, was when Antonio Banderas and his wife march to the lift and he sweeps her over and kisses her. He kicks the button and then it pops shut as they go down. I thought that was brilliant. And likewise,
that was so good.
I thought Antonio Banderas was excellent in it, actually. You could tell he wasn't taking himself too seriously. A throwback to some of the Tarantino work was, if you remember, the guy was smoking red apple cigarettes, which are
Is he actually?
Yeah, which are in all the Tarantino films. And then I quite like the bit where Tarantino, when Band came back in, and there was the tension ramping up before he arrived at the room and his wife's paralytic in his arms, and he's just moseying up. I thought that was quite good. It freaked me out a little bit, the smelling of feet thing. I kind of thought, does Robert Rodriguez have some form of child foot fetish? So that bit was a bit strange. But all in all, I thought it was entertaining. It was probably the most entertaining. At that stage of the film, it was certainly the most entertaining of the 3. And I think it was quite clear that much as Quentin Tarantino, his section was representative of him, this had Robert Rodriguez all over it. It was all style, totally. No substance, but the little artistic flourishes that the actors were allowed to have. The dark humor, which Mikey alluded to, the things such as putting the menthol stuff on the kids' eyes, the bit that I talked about in the lift, yeah, I thought it was okay. There were little bits of gold smattered along a steaming pile of shit.
Yeah, I think I think you hit the nail on the head. Actually, both of you, I think I kind of agree with you a lot on this segment. Yeah, like how cool is Antonio Banderas, man? Like, oh, from first minute till last, the way I think all you need to know about his character is the way that he orders this champagne from Ted. Oh, it's just so cool.
Oh yeah, without even saying the name of the room.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Like him combing his hair back, the way he smokes his cigarette, just everything about Antonio Banderas in this is just so cool. And then yeah, like you're totally right, Matt. Like I think you can tell from this, it's a total sea change. You can tell that Robert Rodriguez is such a better director, so much more stylistic, much better script. I think the script in this is actually really good. For this section, I think it's pretty good. It's not as good as the Tarantino bit. It's the dialogue in this is pretty punchy, pretty snappy, keeps moving along when it feels like it's moving along at a pace when nothing really that much is happening, which is quite cool. And then the ending totally works. It was much better than the other two. I'm sure we can agree. This is where the film starts, in my opinion.
Yes, with about 20 minutes to go.
Yeah, unfortunately with you, Matty, I think the film burnt its bridge with you long before we got to this point.
Yeah.
Cool. So moving on to The Man from Hollywood, directed by Quentin Tarantino, featuring the man himself, as well as Bruce Willis as well, who's uncredited. So just as Ted is at his wit's end and about to quit, he gets a call from the penthouse suite and is urged to serve them before he clocks off. He reluctantly does so, but he finds himself being offered $1,000 for 1 second's worth of work. This is the film, in my opinion, this room. So what did you guys think of this?
Well, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, or I have a different opinion, Sebi, about this piece. I think the problem Tarantino has in this is he has set the bar so high with his previous work. Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, he was the writer for True Romance. All those films have truly great dialogue in them. Great dialogue, inspired casting, some really, sort of unorthodox choices in terms of casting, and just whether it's the non-linear format of Pulp Fiction, which is obviously inspired by his love and knowledge of cinema. And in that, though, he didn't have to sort of point out and highlight this has been inspired by this scene from Deliverance. You just know it. The whole package is just so well done. This, by contrast, I didn't think the dialogue was particularly good. It really did feel like he was going through the motions to a certain extent, and was self-indulgent. I think, as you pointed out earlier, he is effectively playing himself, which is it's an unwelcome self-indulgence. I think Bruce Willis had the good sense to be uncredited in this film, but I think that his part in it could have been played by anyone. Again, I sort of didn't really enjoy it. Yes, this movie is four largely separate segments, but you have to take it as a whole cinematic experience, a whole movie, and I think by this point, I really did want it to be over. but I just didn't really enjoy this segment, and it's part of the reason I formed this cynical theory about the movie, that this was just really hastily put together, bit of a vanity project maybe, but a vehicle to get Brand Tarantino out there and maybe making some money.
I can kind of see it wasn't maybe his best work to the highest of his standards, but as a Tarantino fanboy, which I unashamedly proclaim myself to be, it's still Tarantino, and it's still a lot better than a lot of other stuff that comes out, and it's still a lot better in terms of writing, in terms of the story, and also in terms of the cinematography and the camera work, in my opinion.
I don't know, man. I mean, it's filmed in a room. I mean, the cinematography is probably not necessarily that big a deal. But again, it goes back to my point. By setting the bar so high, and don't get me wrong, I'm a massive Tarantino fan. I do think he's an all-time great director. I love almost all of his movies. He really is a good director, and that's partly why I find this so disappointing, because it's not. Maybe it's better than what a mediocre director would produce, but I don't think it's good work.
Fair enough, mate. Matthew, what were your thoughts on this one?
I thought it was probably every Quentin Tarantino film you've ever seen, but just a shitter version of it.
Wow.
You're quite right, Seb. That's not to say that it isn't the best part of this film. It clearly is, but it bears all the hallmarks of Quentin Tarantino's work at the time. Watching it, I mean, I was like Mikey, praying for the end, and at this stage, and just really hating you with every fibre of my essence for selecting it. But yeah, I think if you reflect on it, the dialogue's quite snappy. There's a lot of tropes of Tarantino's work at the time. Some of the work, like Bruce Willis, is quite good in it.
I think Bruce Willis is really good in this. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's having that secondary conversation with his wife, which that's quite funny. And then as it all kind of reaches a crescendo, and you find out eventually what the story's all about, you get the callback from the character earlier in an earlier scene as well, which neatly ties it all together in some sense. Yeah, I think it probably was a vanity project. He's just brain dumped a scene that could have been inserted into any of his films. And yeah, there's not really much more to say on it. It was unquestionably the best bit of the film, but I think, unfortunately, and he probably didn't even care, it comes at a stage in the film where nobody frankly gives a shit. They're waiting for the end to come, and then it's punctuated with that mincing again at the right last second of the film, which pissed me off. Just watching Tim Roth try and flout about. But
yeah. You seem really, really angry at this film.
No, I'm genuinely not. I feel that Mikey was far more acerbic in his criticism than I was. I'm just dead to the film, to be honest. But yeah.
Brutal. So, look, I think, as I mentioned, the entire reason why I picked this film, or I rate this film in any way, shape, or form, is because of this last 40 minutes. As I said, whenever I watch this film, except for the 2 times I watched it in the run-up to this podcast, I usually just skip over all the other bits and start it at the point where Ted has a conversation with the pothead girl and Betty, because that is when it's so obvious that it's the Quentin Tarantino script sort of beginning. And instantly you can tell that it's Quentin Tarantino dialogue, because it's such a distinctive style, and it's so much better and so much more engaging than anything else, And I love this speech when Tim Roth breaks his sort of posh boy facade and goes into some Cockney English.
I thought it was awful.
Oh, okay, I really, really like it, because he's done it in a couple of other films. He did it most notably in Hateful Eight. And the reason why he's done it, he said in interviews that he kind of likes to make fun of the English higher classes by caricaturing them in this way. So to see him do it here, having sort of known that's what he does, is quite funny. And I also just love the speech. I mean, when he's like, and then there's me walking out the door right now, buenas noches, and it's just so good. I love that bit, because I think that's actually like the most underrated bit in the film, because it's his character just at his total wit's end. And then you get into the Quentin Tarantino bit, and you're right, like it's him just being totally egregious and totally self-indulgent. But he does have his moments. Bruce Willis is quite good. But the two main things I really, really like about this scene is the editing. I actually really like the camera work at the beginning and when they're all sitting around the bar, or where they will get to sitting around the bar, because they're actually two long, like really, really, really long shots, no edits in them whatsoever. You know, when Roth first comes in, the camera like spins around from character to character, moves around, and it basically goes from Tim Roth entering the room to Tim Roth introducing all of the items that he's brought from the room service order. And that's one long shot, which is actually like really impressive.
Yeah, that you're right. That is impressive.
Okay, so at the let's not say that this was The Godfather.
Yeah.
As all films on this podcast will be judged, Liar Liars out of 10. For those who this is their first time listening to us, we judge our golden age of cinema entries against the pinnacle of 90s cinema, that being 1997's Liar Liar, whereby Hollywood perfected cinema and could not do any better. Mikey, I'm going to throw it open to you. Seb, I think it's for you to conclude on this. So, Mikey.
Lads, I'm going to give this 2 Liar Liars out of 10. As I said earlier, I didn't enjoy watching this film, other than the Robert Rodriguez segment was entertaining to me, and fair enough that the fourth room Tarantino is Tarantino. I do remember when this movie came out. I do remember the time, Tarantino riding really, really high, and my theory around the certain amount of cynicism, vanity project, etc. for this film. So it was interesting to watch because it's a different sort of, anthology type films are not common, and to be fair, they're not done well very often. So it was interesting in that sense to watch, but fundamentally I didn't enjoy it. So 2 Liar Liars out of 10.
So for me, I'm going to be as brutal as I feel necessary. I'm going to give it a half.
Half a Liar Liar.
I'm going to give it half a Liar Liar.
Wow.
Savage.
And do you know what really pissed me off was like the picture in, picture out, where you'd see like the love hearts being drawn around the screen and some of the earlier scenes. For me, it was never going to exceed a half when I was having to look at that crap. So the half will be for the mildly entertaining Tarantino scene and Antonio Banderas, who's justified that half pretty much all on his own. But thumbs down from me. I'm glad I'm going to never have to watch it again.
Wow. Totally savage. Okay, well, I'm going to give this film 4 Liar Liars out of 10. You might think that's generous, but how I've come to that is basically as the film does, separated it out into its 4 quarters, and basically the first 2 quarters get 0 Liar Liars out of their 2.5. For me, the last one gets all of its 2.5 Liar Liars out of 10, and the Antonio Banderas Robert Rodriguez segment gets another 1.5. So it's 4 from me.
Thanks for that. Well, that just about wraps up our view on 1995's 4 Rooms. Who knew things could get worse than Point Break? But lo and behold, it did. So I'm going to hand over quickly to Seb just to give us a sneak preview of the next episode. Seb, can you just confirm what we'll be looking at then?
Next week, I can confirm that the randomizer has shown that we're going to be watching Cape Fear, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro.
I think there is a marked jump in quality from the last 2 entrants, that's for sure.
Especially going from this to a psychological thriller masterpiece by Scorsese featuring De Niro.
Yeah, and Nick Nolte, arguably his finest. Well, thanks for that, lads. Anything else to wrap it up?
just from me that life is full of little experiences, some of which are going to stick. So I hope this one sticks with everyone.
Life is indeed like a box of chocolates, but every now and then you get something that's not chocolate. So
Very good. See you next week, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of the Golden Age of Cinema. And if you did, join us next week, where we'll be reviewing Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear, starring Robert De Niro with Nick Nolte and Jessica Lange. So have a watch and join us next time on the Golden Age of Cinema.